Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for some of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Julie Defoe. I'm part of the Go West team. We're very excited about this two-part destination resort situation and market update session series. Today, we have part one, and be sure to mark your calendars for part two taking place Thursday at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. You can register for part two on the Go West Summit website under the Education Week page. Before we get started, we have a couple of details to go over first. You've been muted by the host, which is me, so please make sure you enter all of your questions and comments into the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, we will be recording this presentation so you can look back through this data anytime you want that's convenient, and make sure you prepare your questions for part two of this session. Again, you can register for this on the Go West Summit page. I will now introduce you to Ralph Garrison, who is the founding member of Insights Collective. Ralph, self-described as a destination resort advisor, research analyst, and storyteller. I'm sure that you will understand all of these handles as we dive into the session a little bit further. Ralph is also going to be giving us a quick update from the Brand USA session yesterday that will serve as a starting point for today's session. Please allow me to introduce Ralph.
Thank you, Julia. Welcome, everyone. Pleased to be here as one of the talking heads in the Insight Collective group. My first task is to recap the opening Monday morning session for Go West's virtual webinar series that was presented by Carol Ream, who is the Director of Research for Brand USA. Her 1 hour presentation was really focused on the Brand USA data and perspective that she gathers, which, as many of you know, is based on the international market and compares North America and other countries as targets for international travel, specific to, of course, the USA product itself. Her slide deck went through a pretty good scenario talking about both about the situation, about the consumer, and a little bit about the product. Of course, there can't be any conversation these days that doesn't have a significant amount of focus on the pandemic itself. Her first point was showing travel data, international travel to North America in general and the United States specifically has all but dried up. That shouldn't be a surprise really to anyone based on restrictions and limitations. Using an emotional curve that shows how consumers are shy away from things that are uncertain and then begin to adapt again. There is now some hopeful considerations as some consumers start to get inquisitive and experiment about traveling, the early adopters again, breaking away from others, even in the international market. But the data shows that inbound international travel is not expected to return in any significant quantities anytime soon. That time horizon is the next 12 to 18 months. So certainly through this coming winter season and into the summer season, that time frame would be germane. As they point, the key points to the limitation in travel, the first is the safety concern of the consumers themselves and contracting the virus themselves or passing it on to others. Similarly, is the top consideration that is a travel limiter for them. The second is the limited activities, not only transportation, but the attractions, the dining, the lodging, the things that would make a vacation more like it has always been in the past are being limited, of course, by capacity controls around the virus. And that's a consideration related to the quality of the experience. Finally, Brand USA went through some prerequisites to engagement. They have to do, excuse me, as I read this as carefully as I can, lifting the restrictions for most travelers, and notwithstanding the 2-week quarantine, a low level of the cases, both in the origin and in the destination, the return of flight capacity, obviously internationally, and the reopening of sufficient capacity on the key attractions and the like. That's the supply side. And positive consumer confidence, not only in general, sort of risk consequence, but a willingness to be tested and perhaps subject themselves to quarantining, a comfort as we are all getting used to this new process, this kind of new normal. Bad news, a lot of things we can't deal with. Good news, some of these drivers are in your hands as a destination, within your control, and you could actually move the needle to the advantage of the returning international guest. And should we have time, or when we do, the same is true relative to air transportation, lodging, and of course, working together to limit the pandemic so the restrictions are limited and customers and locals alike feel comfortable. That was the synopsis. And I am now going to pause. Well, I'm not changing hats because I actually only have one, but having recapped yesterday where the Brand USA presentation stopped, we are now going to start with a focus on the US domestic travel, specifically now and looking forward to winter 2021. You see in my notes here that we've already taken care of the international in yesterday's session, and my recap, check that box. US business travel is not faring a whole heck of a lot better in many cases. Perhaps some significant changes coming down the road in how business travel actually re-engages, but it's beyond the scope of today's presentation. So we'll be focusing specifically on the US market, the pandemic economy specific focus, and some looking really at the consumer side of the virus, both in the market and at destinations. What we can learn about consumers' intent to travel and their booking trends going forward. The rhetorical question are the ones that are canceling. The same ones or a different profile than the ones that are booking. And that data that's more quantitative will be accompanied by data that is more qualitative consumer intent to travel. That sets up the scenario around which we will have some internal discussions as our group and lets us prepare for a roundtable discussion, really almost a town hall-like discussion about anything that you want to talk about next Thursday. So we'll stop occasionally to ask the question of you that we ask of ourselves as well, and that is, so what? Data is only as good as putting it together to produce results, and that's part of what we're about. Click the slide, please. Introducing the Insight Collective, a group of individual business persons with their own business interests, but with common interest in the welfare of the destination resort community, and with tools and experience to be able to work together more successfully in helping us put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So you can see that platform. We use the word pandemic economy as the problem we're trying to solve. The tool that we use is the none of us as smart of us as all of us. We're extending that invitation to any of you who have contributions to make to the greater good, or would like to be the beneficiary of the data that we are providing voluntarily for as long as we can get away with it. On the right-hand side, you see the Brady Bunch, the talking heads. Several of the presenters today, Chris, Tom, and Susan, are represented here, while others will be chiming in. The guy on the top right looks like he's trying to qualify for movie stars status. He was actually given an opportunity to be a foot model for 15 minutes about 20 years ago, and it's apparently still gone to his head. So I apologize in advance for his perception, but I can talk very intimately about him. With that, I will ask another slide to be put forward. There you go. So this excerpt that I saw and many of you have seen made me chuckle because that Chinese proverb about may we live in interesting times was originally presented as a curse, and sometimes I think it is, at least when the interest is in this way. But there are some existential problems, that we are encountering that we have never before. And finding reliable data, a good fact base, and something that hasn't already been interpreted by our geopolitical environment is a problem. Of course, you can't manage what you can't measure. There's no doubt that the result is the biggest disruption that we've seen in the leisure travel industry. And some people think we're returning to the old normal. Many of us, certainly almost everyone in this group, thinks that there will be a different reality coming forward. And much of what we're about in the short term as we play defense is positioning ourselves for the long term when we get to turn to offense again. So with that contextual input, I will verbally click the slide. We've set up as part of the Insight Collective process and the think tank, asking a question that can be answered and then determining the scenarios and more specifically, the drivers, that's what we're calling them, upon which those scenarios depend. The 7 that you see here are the primary drivers that we're following, not unlike a hurricane weather forecast would say, what are the variables that are going to determine the path of the hurricane? Metaphorically, of course, those are the scenarios as we track this hurricane through the next little while. Of the 7, we are focusing on the top 3, which are the consumer-facing ones in today's session. We'll reserve the next 4 for a more open discussion on Thursday with anything else that you all want to talk about. So the opportunity for you here is to think about what we're discussing, so what, as we will, what you want to know, and begin to make notes that you can send to us so that we can put them in a queue for the Thursday town hall. That's your job. My job is to suggest a click to the next slide, please. So an overall situation assessment, I won't go into the metaphor, but that's what introduces the next slides and the next presenters. Please click. And there we go. We are featuring Susan Rubin Stewart, the work that she's doing. She will explain to you on our behalf. Ms. Rubin Stewart.
Hi, I'm Susan Rubin Stewart with SRS Consulting Services, and my specialty is consumer insights and contact centers, and I'm doing the virus tracking for the group. So next slide, please. Yesterday, you saw global virus data from Carol Ream, and here's how the US compares to those global hotspots. You can see 2 things here. New cases in the US are starting to decline, and India has bypassed the US, and Brazil is in danger of doing so. Next slide. Some question how much this has to do with decreases in testing in some areas. So we're looking at positivity rates of testing also. You can see a wide range of results though, from Vermont at 0.5% to almost 41% in Mississippi. I wonder, and I need to dig into it further, but I wonder if Mississippi has such a high rate of positivity because the lower your testing rate is, the higher the positivity rate is, because a higher percentage of your testing is people who are showing symptoms. Next slide, please. You've all seen an overwhelming number of graphs the past 6 months. We've been doing something a little bit different, and we're comparing travel feeder markets and destinations. So here you can see a couple things. You can see that Phoenix has seen a really big decrease. First, they had an increase that started at the end of June, and they've now have had a severe, dramatic decrease. And some attribute it to the fact that they were able to finally pass a mask mandate at the towards the end of the month. And next slide, please. And here you can see that Miami's steep growth in new cases in July. They've been able to reduce daily cases in August. Some attribute it to reducing private gatherings to 10 people. They had the issue with large parties in Airbnbs, so they closed down some of the Airbnb properties and reduced private gatherings to 10. The strange bump you see in Dallas was due to a backlog of testing. So if we could go back and regraph that, I think you'd see less of a decline initially there for them.
Susan,
next slide.
Before we progress on this, could you make a comment on the note on the bottom on the custom views and reports? Because this could be interesting to our participants.
Sure. So we've been tracking this tracking here has been for some mountain destinations. So we've been tracking their feeder markets for them. So we can do custom work if someone's interested, and you'll see a little bit more on the destination slide next. So we've been tracking 10 mountain destinations, and in this slide, you'll see that in the gray are several destinations that have really been able to keep their case count flat. And there's 5 destinations that have really had some peaks. You can see that as Jackson Hole, Park City, Crested Butte, Vail, and Aspen. So next slide, please. We are tracking a 3rd spike for Park City though. So that's something for people to keep in mind. Just because we've had a success in a destination doesn't mean it's going to continue on. Next slide, please. So why does it matter? So what? Why track the virus in feeder destination or feeder and destination markets? One reason is to track other destinations' success and failures for best practices. So here's some best practices, or here's some changes. When I showed you those 5 feeder destination markets that had increasing and then declining cases, these are what they attributed their declines to. We have private gathering decrease, we had 2 mass decrease, and we had 1 just getting through the big July 4th weekend. Next slide, please. So does the virus load in someone's home region or their destination matter, or both? Carol at Brand USA said both. I haven't been able to find any survey data to support that, but here's some supporting information. So a Harris poll done in early summer basically said that if you're in one of the hotspots or the hardest hit states, you were really eager to travel. And the reasons you wanted to travel were to connect with loved ones and seeking a change of scenery. And again, they were really craving different surroundings, was the strongest amongst those who were in the hottest hotspots. Next slide, please. So Philip Pierce puts a new spin on why we travel. Now the new reason he proposes that we travel is leaving the stresses of the lived-in community to be in another place where the pandemic is less pressing. So that indicates that at least the destination you're going to is the virus level is important. And as a group, can we use this desire when crafting our message?
Susan, quick comment.
Mm-hmm.
There's some conventional thinking around leisure travel motivation going back some years that distinguish between the people who go to an attraction to recreate and people who leave someplace that they don't want to be, an urban environment, a work hassle or whatever, to recreate, right? So in one scenario, you're going to an attraction. In the other scenario, you're going away from. It's a very fundamental difference in the mindset of the consumer and the way messaging should be caused. Some of us are still going to be going to attractions this coming winter season, but many of us are going away from things we don't like in the urban environment. And that's why I think it's important for the audience to understand that difference, because it relates to the messaging of the motivation of the consumer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph.
A quick comment on that, Ralph. Do you think we're at a point where those actually might be merging more so than they did in the past?
I think there are some that are primary one, there are some that are primary the other, but if you just do a survey of the whole group, it looks like the middle of the road, right? Okay. It is not the middle of the road. It's a bunch of people on the right and it's a bunch of people on the left that represent 2 segments. So be careful when you look at data to not generalize too much.
Thank you.
So again, the question, does case count matter to travelers? So let's confuse that issue even more. In this slide, you see comparison on case count in an adult Mecca and a kid's Mecca. So Vegas is the pink line. The increasing case count actually in July did actually decrease casino foot traffic by 65% when the case count went up 36%. But the reddish orange line indicates Disney. Disney's attendance did not increase, with a dramatic decrease in cases in their Orlando area. So, you know, it kind of goes, it's kind of hard to surmise whether or not case count matters. Maybe we can.
And we were making speculation on this recently that perhaps there is a study right now that's talking about families and a little bit desperate maybe to get out of the house, and that Disney is such an attraction for families. So you weigh that with really wanting to get out and recreate and being a little bit fearful still for your family and taking that into consideration.
Maybe it says that having an increasing case count will decrease your traffic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that coming off that peak will increase your traffic. Maybe the destinations that have been able to keep it fairly flat are the best off. So another thing to consider is the CDC tracks travel health risk in global destinations. Unfortunately, they don't do it in the US. This indicates that case count in destinations should matter. So here's how they assess the risk. So where would your destination fall if you could self-assess? And if you could self-assess as a low risk, how would you use this to your destination's advantage? The next slide. So what?
So here's our so what slide. This is giving us an opportunity to pause a little bit. We'll talk among ourselves and you'll eavesdrop. And at the same time, if you could drop your questions based on this segment or any other questions that you think might be relevant for our Thursday roundtable into either the chat box or the Q&A box. So for the IC team, what is an aha moment that you may have to share with the audience based on these statistics?
I have a, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the interesting things that I saw is that the Harris poll is indicating that people who live in areas of greater incidence of disease are the ones who are really wanting to travel. And that sounds like shooting fish in a barrel from a DMO and a promotional point of view in the target destination. But the other side of that coin is, how do your locals feel about having people coming from a highly infected market to your destination? Is that the person that you really want coming to visit, which might raise cases and make you a less desirable destination? So it turns into one of those sort of catch-22 propositions for destinations, and is just, I think, an example of walking the tightrope on what the data are telling us and how we make these qualified decisions.
Tom, good point, Ralph here. One of the reasons that, to the audience, one of the reasons that Insight Collective is tracking both the destination and the feeder market is just so there's that relationship. Our first hypothesis about this came out of a Lake Tahoe think tank, and it was based on the fact that we thought, for example, if San Francisco got an increase in COVID cases and locked themselves down, Lake Tahoe would be less likely to have visitation. Turns out the opposite is true. Right? When San Francisco locks down, the rats leave the sinking ship and are much more interested in getting away than being part to the Tahoe Basin. And of course, the converse is Tahoe is least excited about having that market. So we've got a real yin and yang in that process. And those that are following Lake Tahoe will also be following the protests now being housed by the locals, both on the weekend inbound and a good riddance party in the streets on the outbound weekend as we try to reconcile, you know, these two different points of view. Those of you that are in the DMO marketplace must know what we're talking about. One quick question of you, Susan, and that is, of course, I know the source of the data and how well you are now presenting it. We're trying to get cause and effect together right? You've got the effect and you're being able to help us understand the cause. But what can you help us do to anticipate what happens next? Is there any way to look down the road and anticipate, what will be happening in a few weeks or a month?
There's some forecasting coming out, but it's difficult. There's different forecasting methodologies out there. I think some of our audience could track your current and historical destination virus status and track it against other similar destinations and your respective feeder markets. Maybe you could get some insight looking ahead and anticipate the next few weeks or months. I think you can look at when some of your mandates were put in place and compare it to what has happened in other destinations. And for example, I'm going to dig in and see what they think is causing Park City's third peak, because I'm sure no one wants to go through another peak.
Yeah, real quick, building on that, Susan. The DMO and the destination's really moving into an interesting place between balancing the viral tracking and its trends and COVID management within the destination, and trying to balance that that dynamic between the two.
Thanks, Carl. We're going to move forward now, and thank you for the questions that you have dropped into the question box. I know that you're going to keep adding them as we go along. So now Tom Foley, who's with Intopia, is going to share some of the data that Intopia has gathered. Tom?
Thanks, Barb. Appreciate it. Tom Foley, SVP of Business Process and Analytics for Intopia and former partner of Ralph Garrison in Destinametrics way back in the olden days. We're going to take a look at Intopia and some Destinametrics data just to take a look at things, setting up consumers and how they're behaving. So let's just start with the ballpark and the ballpark in which consumers are playing. Barb, if you would click once, we'll just take a quick peek at new jobless claims. This is a big piece of the news, and it has a major influence on two things. One is how consumers feel about things. Negative news drives down consumer confidence, with changes consumer spending. The other is, of course, consumers' disposable income. And it depends upon what market you are looking for. We know that lower income earners are losing the majority of the jobs, and those in the service industry, but it also has a flip side problem with the ability to fulfill the services that you want to fulfill in your destination, because you have places that are understaffed and are playing the cat and mouse game of when to staff back up as business returns to the community, or if it returns to the community. Barb, if you just click again, that'll just give you a sense of the mountain that the economy is climbing to get out of the hole that we're in. Barb, there we go. Got a little delay on my side probably. So cumulative jobless claims are sitting just below 60 million since the beginning of March. That's obviously a massive number. There have been there's been excellent progress on job creation over the course of the last couple of months, but the hole that we're in is pretty deep. And as we consider the change in federal support for the state programs that are in place, there's going to be less support for those people that continue to be out of work for long periods of time, and that's going to change disposable income as well, and consumer sentiment around spending. So at the bottom of the screen, what we're looking at is really the three big economic indicators that drive how consumers end up behaving. Traditionally. The first is taking a look at the Dow Jones, which finished up, we're looking at as of the end of July, and it finished up at just over 26,000 points. It's a little closer to 27,500 right now. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. Consumer confidence went down to 92.6 points in July after a slight gain in June. And 92.6 points really puts the consumer in control of what we can do with rate, what we can do with booking, emotion aside, and all things being equal in a standard marketplace. It puts the consumer in the driver's seat, and we really need to be more responsive to how they're willing to fulfill. And then the unemployment rate at 10.2% is dramatically better than 14.7%, which is what it was back in April, but still dramatically high, and at the highest level, by the way, that it was during the 2008-9 recession. Just back to the Dow Jones for a second, it's really a proxy for all financial markets here, and there's a major disconnect going on between what's happening on Wall Street in the financial marketplace and what's happening on Main Street. And that provides some muddiness around guidance and how that's going to work. But we use it because it does influence consumers. Even though Wall Street is really looking at how Wall Street feels when we see this and not what's happening in the greater consumer economy, consumers see it, they feel more confident. It does help buoy that confidence, and their 401ks are not tanking when this is going on, which makes them feel better about what disposable income they might have down the road. So that was a quick blast of the economy. We want to look a little bit at what we're seeing on consumer behavior and bookings, because it's not anything like anything that we're used to from our historic data. So Barb, if you'd advance the screen, that'd be great.
It's being a little cranky.
Okay, I can chat about anything while we wait for another screen. And the data that we're going to take a look at first is really transactions through our Intopia e-commerce platform, which does lodging transactions at 1,700 properties across the United States. And it's easier to describe when we can see it, so we'll see how it comes up. But I will tee it up while we're waiting for that. And what we actually see happening there is we're looking at, here we go. This is net transactions processed per day on average for each of the weeks. So a bar represents a week's worth of transactions average. And back in January 1st, we were processing about 1,292 lodging bookings per day through our system. You can see what happened when the pandemic hit and declaration of a pandemic and the closure of resorts and towns across the country, down to about 1,425 cancellations happening per day during that first week. We're now sitting at about 755 new bookings coming through our system per day. That is seasonally pretty close to where it should be, and a little bit down only because we're seeing the cancellations continue to persist. Though they are about 200 per day now and much lower than they were, there's still about 70 to 80% more cancellations happening this year at this time than there were last year or there are in traditional times. So that's bringing down our net bookings a little bit. But these patterns are actually looking kind of hopeful, but there are some trends in them that are really, really important to note. Barb, if we can advance again, hopefully it won't be cranky and it'll do it for us. We're going to take a peek at booking lead times. Booking lead times, traditionally at this time of year, you're taking a reservation and it's not arriving for about 61.5 days. But what we have seen really since the end of May is booking lead times coming down below 30 and dipping down to almost 25 days at one point. So what's happening here is that consumers, as we understand it, are doing a couple of different things. And the first one is, I call this the metaphorical equivalent of knowing their current conditions in their destination and their health rate, knowing the conditions in the destination to which they're traveling and what the policies are there. And basically saying, looking over their shoulder and saying, coast is clear, let's go. And so arrivals are really for short leads. That has the benefit of allowing us to fill in the short lead, but has the detriment of not allowing us to get that good baseline of reservations that we want for 60, 90, 120, 188 days down the road. But they're staying longer. So Barb, if you just go to the next slide, they're staying longer and they're staying longer for different days. And this is sort of part of the isolation travel. So what we're seeing here is the month of August transactions, and the weekends are called out with Friday and Saturday days. And the line that's traveling through here is whether or not each of those arrival days on the calendar in August is seeing bookings that are longer than traditional or shorter than traditional. And a good example would be on the left-hand side, we can see that there's a 1.46 for a Saturday there. That means that all the bookings arriving on that Saturday when aggregated are actually staying almost 1.5 days longer than they did last year. The following Saturday's 1.2, it's 1.16 for the Saturday of the 22nd and 2.11 for the following Saturday. And what we're getting out of that is that people are wanting to come, stay Sunday, Monday, Tuesday when it's traditionally quieter, and have more space to themselves, be out in the open a little bit more. They might also be taking advantage of lower room rates. But that is an interesting way that the pandemic is having us fill in the early part of a week. Sundays are actually seeing longer stays as well. And Mondays, for the most part, are seeing even or longer stays. Wednesdays are too. So it's an interesting thing. And this has been going on since July. And it's getting stronger as we go into August. It'll be interesting to see and look ahead to September when we get some good critical mass to see what that tells us.
Tom, quick question.
Yes.
As we begin to look forward into the winter season, will the same phenom maybe change travel patterns? I'm thinking about the drivers of businesses continuing to allow people to work from home or wherever, schools having virtual learning. Now all of a sudden it's not so important for the family to use a weekend or a holiday to travel. And might that result in an increase in lower season business and the decrease in those peak time periods, also giving the resort community a chance to level out their supply considerations?
And that's a great point, because I was reticent in saying that in addition to that, there are a lot of freedoms that families have that they didn't have before, and homeschooling is among them, as well as not being tied down to an office. And so they can travel Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And I think it's going to actually work to help to level down that supply. And we've actually got data where we're seeing patterns with traditional peaks and valleys between weekend and weekday are actually closed up quite a bit. The lines are a lot smoother. We don't have that to show you today, but it's an important one.
Silver lining anywhere we can find it, right?
Right, exactly. And lastly, I want to talk about sort of wave dynamics. A lot of news is out there about the positivity of bookings, either it's day over day or month over month, but we really need to look at the volume and the wave volume, the demand of what's taking place. So we've got two examples up on the screen here, and on the left-hand side, we're looking at bookings taken in each of the months along the bottom of these charts for arrival within 0 to 90 days. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the Southeast region. And at the end of May and into June and July, they did a really dramatic reopening. And we can see that they went from these incremental fill numbers that were down very sharply, 40 to 60%, to a really strong positive wave. But we know that pent-up demand behaves literally like a wave. It does crest and it does die down and fade out a little bit. And in the Southeast, we've seen it come down actually quite dramatically, and they're really only incrementally filling now just a little bit above flat, which is below seasonal fill and standards. So when we take that and we apply it to the West, who are sort of lagging by 60 days behind the Southeast in how they're opening or when they're opening, and they're doing it more cautiously, at least in the destinations that we track, we can see that there was a recovery that sort of climbed up in April, and then it leveled out a bit in May as things were cautious. And that crest of the wave didn't get as high, but it's already peaked. It's heading back down. Now, part of that is the wave dynamics of pent-up demand. Once you satisfy that particular pent-up traveler, that's going to be satisfied, and you get back to the regular traveler who's not entirely sure what's going on. Another part of that is going to be changes in seasonality and the end of the summer season coming and going into shoulder. So we're trying to account for that as we do these projections with the dotted lines forward into August and September and what we expect to see. But what we need to remember when we look at this then is that yesterday's bookings do not infer what's going to happen today, and so on and so forth as that demand changes. And lastly, we get questions about whether drive destinations or pure destinations are really doing better. And if we measure in terms of revenue, in this chart, we're looking as of July 31st, everything to the left of July 31st in that line in the middle is historic actual data of how the months performed. The left hand of each data set is drive destinations, and the right hand is pure or flight destinations. And this is RevPAR, which is an analog for revenue, which is an analog for lodging taxes, which fund the DMOs. And for the most part, we're seeing that they're actually fairly even all the way through, which is interesting, because they have very different performance data compared to, in their year-over-year performance on occupancy and their year-over-year performance on room rate. But in the end, they're almost flat to each other on their year-over-year performance on revenue. So a lot of different roads lead to success depending upon your market and how you're reacting to the different consumer that you've got. That, I believe, brings to an end the Intopia-based data part of the conversation. I'll see if we've got some so what's to add to my so what.
Thanks, Tom. Great info. A little bit of silver lining in there. A little bit.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's hard not to find a silver lining after March and April, right? Things are going to be improving. But the question that this group has to wrestle with is, what is that going to look like, and how do you plan for what's ahead when the variables are clearly so many?
Right. And I think what we'll do, I'm going to ask the participants, the audience, to again, keep entering those questions into the chat box and the Q&A box, either one, so that we can build on those for our town hall on Thursday. We're going to transition right now, right into Chris Cares with RRC Associates. He's got some really interesting survey information from Mountain Travelers, from the retail side of things that will be pertinent to how we plan our way through and beyond this. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Barb. I'm Chris Cares again with RRC Associates. I'm a managing director and one of the founding partners at RRC. And we work heavily with recreation and tourism. And on this team, I'm really one of the data group trying to connect some of the data dots that we've identified and some of the challenges that are out there in obtaining good information. Today, I'd like to talk about 3 different consumer-based studies. So we're kind of shifting gears here to what's the consumer saying. The first that I'm going to quote from is by Destination Analytics, and they're a strong firm that's doing some great work. If you're not familiar with them, I'd encourage you to get familiar with them. And we're going to look at a little bit of data from them. And then 2 studies that our company, RRC Associates, has done together with the Insights Collective. One is a mountain traveler sentiment survey. And what that's looked like over time is people who are in the databases for mountain communities, but they're really travelers from all over the country, and they're summer visitors as well as winter. So we believe that they're quite projectable to a lot of the communities you all represent. And then we've done a second study of urban sentiment, people who are in the databases of cities, and we'll look briefly at some results from that study. So starting with the destination analysts work, which I'm borrowing from, but really want to give them credit for the great quality work they've done. What this looks like is the answer to a question that says, how concerned are you personally about contacting the virus? And the red line is indicative of levels of concern that are really between 65 and 70%. And you can see the line has remained really static over time. It's flat. And that's one of the challenges, is that the optimism that things were going to improve really hasn't been borne out in some of the consumer data at this point. So we continue to watch this, but it's an important trend. They also, destination analysts, asked a question about how much do you agree with the following statement: I expect the coronavirus situation to be resolved before fall begins. And what you see in this pie chart over on the left is that there's pretty strong disagreement, almost 70% saying at this point in time that they don't expect it to be resolved. And that compares to back in May when it was about 51%. So the upper line here you see is this gradual disagreement about this problem, the pandemic, resolving itself by fall. And I think that, again, that consumer sentiment carries over to some of the other things we'll be talking about. Next. Changing gears and looking at the mountain travel sentiment data, and let's just go to the next slide, Barb. One of the questions we asked in this study, and at this point we have upwards of 35,000 responses. So we have a really robust data set that's led us through a variety of different crosstabs and analysis of that data. One of the findings is that the travelers are really eager to get back to traveling. And you see that in the bar chart, the line chart down in the lower right corner, where over time, as we've done this study, there's a gradual improvement in the eagerness to travel. And that is a really obviously positive indicator. But as we go to the next slide, and as we consider what's going on nationally, there's this constant balancing between health and the desire to travel and the ability to feel safe in communities. And so that's really, it's almost a theme in terms of our thinking about how do we address the consumer in our own communities in light of their safety concerns and their desires for travel. This chart shows the results of some of our research where we asked the question about thinking about your first leisure trip. Do you expect to visit a destination you visited before or a new destination? And by and large, the travelers are telling us they either don't know, or 61% saying they're going back to a destination they know. And we think that's an important finding at the local level. You're really likely to be dealing with travelers who are familiar with you. They're your best candidates, and you really need to be, tapping your databases, going back and communicating in a whole variety of ways with your past consumers. That's where you really want to start your marketing efforts or maintain your marketing efforts as we go into, as we continue forward. Really, it's been in place since the spring. Next slide.
In the last couple of weeks, Chris, that number of have visited before compared to new destination has really increased.
That's right. Next slide. We asked the question, what would be your biggest concerns about starting to travel again? And at the very top of the list is safety of air travel. And it's followed by going to COVID hotspots and an inability to maintain social distance. And I think all of these challenges are ones that clearly are of concern to you at the local level, but they're also ones where the national press and the attention has been focused on a lot of aspects of travel, and the inability to maintain social distance, and now the engagement of the masks as a part of social distancing and part of health is right up there near the top in terms of concerns. But right at the very top is the safety of air travel. Next, please. We asked about the likelihood of visiting and what information would make you more likely to visit. And at the top of this list is health and safety measures being implemented at the destination, and then the ability to cancel trip reservations. So, those sort of yin and yang of I want to be safe, but I also want to have the bailout opportunity if I need to, is right at the top of the consumer's mind. And I think in part it reflects back on the discussion we were having earlier about whether people are going from places that they want to get away from, or going to places where they want to, enjoy their visit and try something recreationally that they hadn't had an opportunity to do. Next slide. So this is one where what we're doing is we're overlaying the destination analyst data, or we're overlaying the mountain traveler data on top of the destination analyst data. So what you see is the answer to a question, at this moment, how safe would you feel doing each type of travel activity? And at the very top, on the left-hand side, is dispersed outdoor recreation. People feel most safe about that. And the dark blue line, the 93%, is mountain travelers. They feel particularly safe in the outdoors. Second highest rated in terms of safety is taking a road trip. And that's high nationally among all travelers, but it's particularly high among mountain travelers. And as you go down the line here, you see it grading over to the red zone on the left. At the very bottom, attending a conference or convention and traveling on a cruise line are two activities that both the mountain travelers and nationally are concerned with, and the mountain travelers are even more concerned than the overall average. So I think we've been monitoring these trend lines, and if you'll go to the next slide, we've been monitoring over time in our mountain traveler work, and what you see is that there's been very little change in any of these lines. And this graph reflects the Mountain Traveler, but the same is found nationally, that the lines are flat. Over time, we haven't seen a big surge in people feeling safer over time. And that presents some challenges. It also represents, we think, a set of data points that are worth tracking at your local level, because this may be an indicator as we hopefully start to see shifts to the more positive, people feeling safer, it opens opportunities. Next. So when you look at this list of activities, taking a road trip at the really very near the top, and then traveling on a commercial airline, quite a bit lower in terms of perceived safety. And certainly you're seeing that in your own communities. This is just reinforcement of the road trip versus commercial airline. On this slide, you see that, and this is the national data, when do you expect you'll take your next road trip? It's not really till middle of next year that you see the light blue bar, 29.2, way over on the right, as commercial airline travel coming back in the eyes of the destination analyst consumer. So that continues to be a challenge, and it reinforces the idea of road trips being where the action is in the near term. Next slide is one that, it's just a quote from a study that I happened to see yesterday, and it's odds of getting COVID on an airplane are slimmer than you think. And I think part of what it prompts for me is this idea that we're all partners in this together. We need to get air travel back. All of us have a place in the communications with potential travelers, and the sooner we can reinforce the ideas of what's accurate in terms of safety on drive trips as well as airlines is going to be an important need over time. Another finding is this dining. We asked about dining outdoors at a restaurant versus dining indoors, and there's a huge gap here. And this is a gap that obviously is important to the ski industry as we look to cold weather, but it's really important in a lot of your communities where you've moved a lot of the dining outside, and we will want to try to gradually bring people inside. And again, I think part of this is reinforcing the idea that we need partnerships. We all have a role to play and a reason to want to see our dining and our shopping come back. And clearly there's a real challenge in terms of consumer attitudes on restaurants and shopping at this point. And then finally, just a couple slides from a study that we did in urban areas. These slides reflect, and we'll go to the next slide. These are the results from Fort Lauderdale, Tempe, and Santa Monica. So a West Coast, an Arizona, and a Florida destination, and we've just lumped them together to take a look at what people are saying on a couple questions. And one of them is what safety measures are important. At the very top of the list was all employees required to wear a mask, all customers required to wear a mask, hand sanitizer, and you can see a gradation in this listing on the left-hand side. At the bottom is temperature checks, which still are viewed as important by almost 70%. I think the real finding here is we asked about all these categories. There's some differences, but they're all important. Next, please. We also asked over the next 3 to 6 months, how concerned are you about the following? And the categories, and these were really health and economic challenges that were identified most frequently. Risk from COVID-19 to the health of vulnerable groups was at the very top. Loss of restaurants, retailers, and other small businesses was right behind it. And then a national or global economic recession. So you've got these health concerns, also a magnified set of concerns around the economy, and trying to find this balance between recovering the economy while dealing with the health concerns is a challenge. And finally, this chart shows a question that asks about impacts on spending. So this is consumers from the 3 cities, Fort Lauderdale, Tempe, and Santa Monica, talking about whether they've been impacted? Has their spending been impacted? And if you look at the right-hand corner, I take this as a little bit of good news, if you will. It reinforces this idea that there's not only pent-up demand for travel, but there's the opportunity to garner the fruits of pent-up demand for spending. The very bottom is leisure travel. People haven't spent much money on leisure travel in the last 6 months. They haven't spent much on fashion. They haven't spent much on grooming, and really they haven't spent much on meals. And so the question is, how can we as communities and as people selling these kinds of products offer the consumer new opportunities to spend in ways that maybe are very different from what we've had in the past. And then the last slide, and this one really just reinforces our belief that there's a lot of sources of data. You should be tracking data. We're certainly available to help you track data. And it begins at the national level, comes down through the county levels. I pointed out colleges and universities, and I think they are one of the kind of the front lines right now in terms of bringing people back into their community, trying to communicate protocols and very elaborate messaging, and also coming forward with lots of new testing. And I think as particularly the winter destinations are trying to open up in a different way in winter and bringing different staff online, there's a lot of similarities to what we're seeing at the university level. And I would suggest this is one place for data. And then again, at the bottom of this chart, all of us are available as resources if we want to go deeper, and also in light of the discussion we're going to have on Thursday. So that's the, yeah, go ahead.
None of us are going to take it personally that you mentioned we're not spending anything on personal grooming.
Well, we've watched ourselves evolve on video over time, right? Yeah, it's a challenge.
Nope, not going to say anything.
Yeah.
So we're getting to the so what, which is also the close of this session 1. And I'm going to turn it back to our storyteller, Ralph Garrison, to talk a little bit more about the Thursday session 2 of this program, and encourage all of you, if you haven't registered yet, register. It's going to be much more of the free-flowing conversation now that we've put some data out in front of you to absorb over the next couple of days. So, Mr. Garrison, you're muted, Mr. Garrison. Hard to tell a story that way.
Let me talk to the rest of you instead of myself, as I often do. A quick so what on Chris's data, which complements Tom's, takes me back to the top of the conversation about the drivers that we're tracking that we believe are going to determine the best scenarios versus the worst scenarios, the winners versus the losers. You can see in the advanced reservation data into the future, whether through Tom's data at Intopia or other data with groups that are well known like Smith Travel Research and the like. For those of you that have access to that data, that is one forward-looking indicator. The second is the consumer's interest and intent to travel, which is why we're laying this data out in front of you. Many of you may be thinking about how you are going to staff and resource your coming winter promotional programs and your staff and like, and we believe that the guidance that is available in this type of data will help you with an informed decision that's evidence-based on fact, which is what we think our job is here. So Chris's data provides insights, almost all of which is in one way or another related to the safety, the perceived safety of the visiting guest in one way or another, which at the end of the day, your community does have some control over if only we could work together better than we have. So we will be taking session 2 on Thursday morning at 11. We've teed up several times that it is a pretty much a free-for-all town hall. The opportunity is for you to tee up anything you would like to direct us to talk about. We aren't scared of hard questions, but we reserve the right to pass if we can't do justice. That's the good news. The bad news is absent guidance from you, we will talk amongst ourselves about the additional drivers and what we see going on, exchanging that conversation. A couple of things that I'm going to tee up just as food for thought are in the next several slides as I close. Please click the slide. And those of you who send questions in to that email link down below will be addressed in the order that we get them in that, for what it's worth. So this goes back to the top of the conversation. We went through the top 3 drivers. The next ones in yellow now are available for us to talk about down the road, and how that plays, including a potential paradigm shift for the DMOs, and some things that are just unfurling, if you will, right now with schools and their impact on how people make decisions. Other things in our think tank that we either have begun or are beginning to think about, click please, are in these following categories. This is just a primer for those of you. This notion about the return of demand and the limited supply of vacation is kind of a problem that we're all having in the process. But we have an opportunity to talk specifically about the attractions, group special events, ski, golf, and the like. Lodging and the lodging bed base, we did not get to a question specifically about vacation rentals and how that segment might behave differently than condos and hotels. We'll take care of it. Transportation, we've touched on about drive, but the fly dynamics actually do create some opportunities that were oblique in this early conversation for those of you that are dependent upon the air travel market. Else you must commit yourself just to the drive market, right? Pretty binary in that place. Click. Another category of items that I'll mention is sort of the other forces at play. Tom talked about the exuberant financial markets, what we're to learn from them. I'm using the phrase breakdown of geopolitical order because it sounds much more professional. I would usually use the word cluster with a suffix of your choice. The social justice movement that ensues, the role of technology that's coming to pass, how home and school you can read as well as I can. Anybody that wants to talk about any of those, let us know and we will prioritize them. One more slide, I think. Yes, the good old destination tourism and perhaps a reorganization of how we work together in the future differently than we have in the past. A sort of hierarchy of needs, but destination-based for those of you that follow that marketing principle. The rest of it you can see here, and I am now looking forward to the final slide, I think, and closing this session almost on time. So reiteration, Thursday at 11, email questions to info@theinsightcollective.coms. If you like what we're doing, please address those to me. If you aren't so sure or have constructive criticism, would you please send those to Tom? Thank you, Tom. We've been doing this for a long time, and I love this part of the relationship. Final comments from anyone? Going twice? We are adjourned. Thank you.
It goes to Julie. We're going to send it over to Julie.
Julie.
Thank you all for joining us today, and a big thanks to the Insights Collective team for putting this together for us. We're looking forward to your attendance on part 2 of this series on Thursday at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. Please register if you haven't already. You can do that at gowestsummit.com on the event week. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye.